Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Cimpatico Studios where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on Cimpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, today our guest is Dr. Hanne Knaepen. Hanne works as a policy officer on climate change and sustainable food systems at the European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM, in Brussels. She received her PhD in environmental studies from Kyoto University. Her dissertation focused on mainstreaming climate adaptation into development. Hanne will provide an overview of African and European positions in global climate policy and analyzes what adaptation means in the context of European and African relations. Hanne offers insights into the diverse adaptation needs across Africa and what roles Europe can or cannot play in meeting those needs. Hey, Anna, welcome to the show.
Hi, Doc. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, well, here we are. We're having our interview. I'm so excited that we're going to talk here. It's been a long journey. But first off, I'm checking with folks. You're in Brussels. And what's going on with the pandemic and COVID-19? How's it sort of really quickly influencing what you're doing there?
Well, the situation was really bad when starting in March, and then the government took very strict measures, and we all had to stay inside. Then they were able to flatten the curve somehow, and but everyone was kind of afraid there would be a second wave of corona, but rather in autumn. But it started, unfortunately, already last week. So now again we have strict measures, but shops are still open, restaurants as well. But yeah, it's again a bit not as strict as where we were in March and April, May, but still situation doesn't look very good with about, I think, 300 people infected every day. So that's quite a lot. Yeah.
Well, we envy your position. We wish you well, but yeah, the 300 a day, I think we're up to 50,000 a day. All right, let's shift away from COVID for the moment. And can you tell me, what is ECDPM? Who are you guys?
Right. So ECDPM stands for European Centre for Development Policy Management, as you already said. We are a think tank. We do policy research, policy analysis. We give also policy advice. And we look at Europe-Africa relations. And within this, because that's extremely broad, we have a number of specific topics that we focus on. So we have a team, for example, looking at peace and security issues. We have a team looking at food systems, and I'm part of that team. And we are also increasingly working on climate change and specifically climate adaptation. And so we publish a lot of papers. We have short policy briefs, more in-depth discussion papers. And then we also organize webinars. We take part in panel discussions. Yeah, that's a bit in a nutshell, I think, what ECDPM does.
Well, it sounds like a lot. Well, let's talk about Africa a bit. So I want to kind of get back into how you're working with them, but what does adaptation mean for Africa? So you're a think tank kind of looking at these issues, but so how do you sort of jump into that issue of adaptation with Africa?
Yeah, right. So that's huge as a topic. I think the way that we are now looking at it is from a European perspective. So we would look at the recent milestone policy declarations of Europe and what then they mean for Africa and for adaptation. So I can give you an example. You may have heard of the European Green Deal. It was announced at COP25 in Madrid last year. And so the aim of this Green Deal is to make Europe carbon neutral by mid-century, and also to decouple industrial growth from resource use. And it's the first time in history that a group of countries, a continent, comes up with such an ambitious deal and plan, green plan. So we would look at this from the perspective then of Africa and what does it mean for adaptation. And so when you look at the Green Deal, you see that there is a lot of focus on renewable energy, on mitigation, and not so much on adaptation. And so that's a pity in a way. Another thing that some Africans may perceive this Green Deal as a form of environmental imperialism, because there is talk now in Europe, and you may have heard of it, of a carbon border tax. So the EU would put quotas on imported on the emissions that were emitted during the production of certain goods that are being imported into Europe. And so African countries are scared because they are still emitting, not so much if you compare it to if you look at it from a global scale, but still. So they are afraid of this carbon border tax. It's not agreed yet, but it's an idea that Europe is playing with, and also and how the design of this carbon border tax would look like. So that's one thing. So another is that Europe is quite against, in the overall policy, fossil fuel use, and they are also trying to decrease that. But African countries, based on the principle of the right to development, they want to still grow and have also the possibility to emit to a certain extent for their own growth. And so there are, like, in that sense, some issues related to the Green Deal, and that's how we would the type of work that we do.
Well, and so the green, I haven't looked at it. So the Green Deal in Europe, and you'd mentioned it doesn't really cover adaptation much. I mean, there's a little bit though, or just it's as a think tank. Did you get to weigh into that process? I mean, what could improve upon that the Green Deal and helping what you're doing in Africa?
So the Green Deal was announced, and then our role is to analyze it and give suggestions of how to implement it, because there is no plan yet, no detailed plan how to implement it. And also, it's an important point to make is that this Green Deal is based on strategies. So you have a circular economy strategy that they are working, they may have released already, a biodiversity strategy, and then a from farm to fork strategy, looking at food systems and agriculture in Europe. And they're working on an adaptation strategy specifically. So that will underpin the Green Deal. And this adaptation strategy, so they are now working on it, and through a public consultation. So together with partners of a consortium project I'm now working on, we are also working on ideas to feed into this adaptation strategy. So there is hope, because they will come up early next year. They will come up with a specific adaptation strategy as one of the pillars of the Green Deal. Yeah.
And just hearing that, so do the concerns from some of the African countries that it might, prevent them to maybe economically grow like they want to. That's on the mitigation side, but then you're focused on the adaptation side. So there's that tension within the Green Deal. Like, you obviously want to focus on adaptation. I'm sure some of the African countries, there's probably more of a spirit of collaboration in that side of the climate issue versus maybe some of these other issues on mitigation and carbon emissions. So do you see that tension? Are people more welcoming to your message of adaptation when you're working with the African countries?
Yeah, but it also depends on which African country. So now we are, for example, working on a study in Tunisia. And when you look, so it's important always, when you talk about adaptation or mitigation, to look at the NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions that countries have submitted or are still in the process of revising and submitting before COP26. So it's part of the UN FCCC process. And so when you look at the nationally determined contribution, the NDC of Tunisia, you see that there is a lot of emphasis on renewable energy, and they're looking for investments. In fact, $18 billion of investments they would like to welcome for renewable energy, and only 2 billion they are requesting for adaptation. But the situation is completely different when you look at a country in the Sahel, for example, that has, like Niger or Burkina Faso, that has extreme desertification issues, droughts. So there they have much stronger adaptation needs. But overall, I think there are almost 50 NDCs of African countries ready, I think 48 to be precise. And overall, when you put them all together and you compare them, there is a very strong focus on adaptation, and specifically on adaptation in the agricultural sector. Currently, there are 3 out of 5 Africans that are directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture, which is it's huge. It's more than half of the people, and it's very important for adaptation that there is a very strong focus on projects in sustainable agriculture, for example, through climate smart agriculture. Um, so yeah, but still overall, I think the situation is very different. Also, if you look at South Africa, they have a very strong mitigation interests. And the challenge is always for the African group of negotiators, so the AGN, they are the ones who come up with a common position for Africa as a continent to take part in the UN climate negotiations. So it's always difficult to come to a common position on what does Africa want. But I think, yeah, based on the NDCs, as I said, there is a very strong interest in adaptation.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was sort of saying we're generalizing in the sense that like Africa is obviously made up of many different countries, and it's not they all have sort of different positions, and so you have these entities that sort of represent the broader landscape there. But how do you determine, like, even as a think tank, you mentioned Tunisia, but like you can't work in every country. I mean, are there target countries that you're working with right now?
Yes, there are. So depending on projects that we do, we would have certain focal countries. I think for a number of years now, these tend to be quite the same in East Africa. There's a lot of work we do in Kenya, and then also in also Uganda, for example, Zambia we also worked, and then also in West Africa. But in recent years, more and more North Africa. So I'm doing a study, as I said, on Tunisia, and North Africa is so close to Europe. It's just under Europe, so it's a very strategically it's a very important region. But yeah, more from a mitigation perspective than from an adaptation perspective.
And I'm curious too, you're in Europe, and so adaptation might mean something in Europe. And when adaptation actions that different countries are taking in Europe versus adaptation actions in Africa, where's the crossover? And then, how do those things differ? In the United States, we kind of approach it a little bit differently too. There's still not kind of like that universal adaptation because, adaptation in Africa might mean people, like you said, drought and people just kind of surviving on the landscape. How does that factor into what you're doing, these sort of different ways of looking at adaptation?
Right. I must say that overall, the type of work I do is more looking at policy level, so mostly continental, so Europe-Africa
Okay.
relations and these big policy frameworks that I follow, so a bit less on the ground. However, we have done a project that was more on the ground. That was yeah, in Kenya, looking at climate smart agriculture options. Even now, we are starting a project in Burkina Faso where we look at rice production, and it's very unsustainable the way that rice is being produced. So it has an impact on the climate, and at the same time, they have the impact of climate. So it's a kind of two-way thing. So and there I looked at certain solutions. So there is a system of rice intensification. I think it's actually coming from an American, maybe Cornell University or so, that developed the system, and they applied it in Madagascar first, and it's quite effective. So I have written and papers actually in the past that presenting this as quite a successful tool, and how it can be used. Now, again, I will use it for the work that we will do in Burkina Faso, suggesting this but that would be completely different from adaptation in Europe, of course. We don't grow rice in such amounts, and and also the impacts are very different. The climate impacts are very different here. But yeah, that's not immediately part of the focus of my work. So
And as a think tank too, you must have to look at the different mechanisms that are out there. If you look at even the Paris Agreement, I think it did a relatively good job, at least kind of thinking about adaptation. You look from the previous agreements, adaptation was barely showing up, but then you just mentioned this European Green Deal, and it doesn't necessarily have much on adaptation. Is it sort of your role, especially if you're, if it's relevant to Africa, to kind of figure out how these different international agreements, you can use those to engage with the countries in Africa?
Yes, yes. So we would do an analysis of these policies, write policy briefs about it, explain the issues at stake, and also try to organize meetings with people, different types of stakeholders who would be interested in this, bringing them around the table and discussing these issues. That's the kind of work that we would do. And then I think because we are a non-partisan center, neutral, so we are not an advocacy center, but we are able, when we would organize these type of discussions around adaptation and the lack of adaptation in the Green Deal, to have people from the NGOs, people from the Commission, people from African Union, for example. So and we can facilitate these type of meetings
I
as a
don't.
non-partisan think tank.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, and I don't know if you follow it all. Like we've had our own Green New Deal that's been proposed in the United States. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. It actually does a decent job of looking at adaptation, but right now it's just an aspirational piece of policy. It's not being implemented in any way. Is the Green Deal in Europe? Is there actual money now dedicated toward it, or is it still just a kind of a guiding strategy?
For now, it's mainly still a strategy, but what is interesting is that a few days ago, there was a huge European summit that was supposed to take 2 days, but it took 4 days, 91 hours meeting without stopping. So it's quite amazing to discuss the EU budget. And so every 7 years, they renew the EU budget. So this one would start in 2021. And so they agreed, I won't tell you the boring details about this, but so they agreed on 1.8 trillion euros for a 7-year period. So this is for everything: internal EU budget, also development cooperation, what I would look at, and also the EU recovery fund. So it's called the next generation EU budget. So it's to recover from the Corona crisis. And what I can say is that it's very clear in the wording of the new budget that every activity, any new policy should not do harm to the environment. So that means there is climate mainstreaming, and at the same time, 30% of all activities should go to climate action. Especially development cooperation activities. And then also when it comes to this next generation EU budget, so the new recovery budget, that's about 0.8 trillion. So 1 trillion will go to the EU budget, and then an extra 0.8 trillion will go to the next generation EU budget. The idea is that is completely in line with the Green Deal. So all the new investments that are very necessary, especially coming from the private sector, they should be in line with the main goal of Europe becoming carbon neutral by mid-century. So that's very important. But now it's up to countries, EU member states. It's a very complex process how this works. They have to now apply to this new budget and explain the situation, the needs in their countries. And so it's a bit up to them then to implement, to do certain investments, to use this budget, and to make sure it's green as possible.
Okay, I got a question from the community room, and it's back from a point you made a bit earlier, and it was about that potential carbon tax that Europe's thinking. And this is from Kayla. Could the tax end up cutting African countries off from international trade? That's an implication.
I think when African countries criticize the Green Deal, and especially this carbon border tax, I think that's for being some type of environmental imperialism or neocolonialism. I think that's a bit the fear that they would be cut off from trade. But I think the EU would try to avoid that, and this may not even become a reality. There is an interesting analysis I read about it, that it's very difficult to measure the way the emissions during a production process, especially for goods coming from Africa. There are still 2 out of 3 Africans working in the informal sector, and even when you have certain goods that are being produced, the different parts come from the informal sector. There is no way to measure emissions. So it's likely that this will not happen. There will not be, or if there would be a carbon border tax, the idea, of course, there will be many negotiations about this, but that it would not be to the detriment of African trade with Europe.
Okay, so I don't know if it's this October or October 2021, but there's a Europe-African summit that's taking place in Brussels and virtually. And so could you confirm when that is? And then what's on the agenda and regarding climate commitments and such?
Yeah. So it's, I believe, every 3 years, a very big summit between the European Union and the African Union. And so last time it was in Abidjan, in Nigeria, and so this time it will be in Brussels. There may be a physical meeting between the heads of states. That's still to be confirmed, but yeah, most of it will be virtual meeting. And climate change is very important. It's I think it was going to be the biggest priority on the agenda. Now probably COVID and crisis response. But still, there's now we see, so climate diplomacy is also very important and very tricky between Europe and Africa, between the two unions. And we saw that now in the run up to the summit in October, they are building a kind of climate alliance between both. And so even without this climate alliance, there is a lot of before every COP, so every session of the Conference of the Parties, there is a lot of work being done between Europe and the African group of negotiators, and other African entities negotiate to come to a common position, sometimes with success, sometimes not. But for example, they say that one of the reasons that behind the success of the Paris Agreement, that there was an actual agreement at the end of COP21, is because of a coalition of ambition between Europe and the ACP countries, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific, and some other countries. And I think also during the Durban COP, I believe it was in 2011, if I'm not wrong, there was also a lot of push from Africa and Europe together, and trying to convince states like Brazil and Russia to be more proactive. There's also a joint Africa-Europe strategy, and they focus a lot on climate. So you have a lot of platforms, maybe even, you could say too many. And it's to some extent, there is some fragmentation of different agreements between Europe and Africa that all discuss climate next to trade and health and security, peace and security, very important topic. So to some extent, there may be there may be too many platforms and policies, and you can also question whether that is really effective and what is most effective, and did they actually lead to success, to anything. That's also something that I think should critically assess, and that's something that we do. And there is always a difference. Yeah, you can always interrupt me.
No, go on. I don't want to interrupt you. Go on, finish, please.
So there is a difference between technical during these platform discussions. They discussed purely technical issues, and they're more political. And we see that they had some the most effective discussions are when it comes to concrete projects. They had also like the Great Green Wall, for example. The idea was to build a wall from Senegal all the way, so from west to east. In Africa. So, and it has been very difficult, because it also then depends on countries to implement, to plant these trees. But I think it was more successful in terms of projects and implementation of projects than a real political, and being aligned on certain priorities. And it often comes down to adaptation, and who is going to pay for adaptation and for resilience building.
Okay, well, we're actually near there. We just blew through that time, and I want to just sort of wrap this up by just asking, what's next for you? I know your travel is severely curtailed in these times, but what do you got planned for the next 3, 6 months or so?
Well, good thing is in August I'm off. I have a month of leave, so I'm looking forward to that starting next week. But yeah, then in September the plans that we had going to Tunisia for me, then for my project, and do Burkina Faso for colleagues, for example, these are now put on hold. So yeah, the good thing is that the type of work that we do, our policy analysis and writing, it's easy to do from home, and we already worked a lot from home even before Corona
Okay.
existed. So um, yeah, I think from September we will continue doing that. Yeah, writing, and unfortunately without missions, but who knows? Um,
Right.
Things could change, and then we can travel again.
Okay, well, this has been great learning experience, and we've chatted before, but would love to kind of get you back on as this sort of work progresses, and you've had a whole bunch of ideas of maybe other people that we could interview, and yeah, we
Yeah,
just want to keep this dialogue up and want to just propose to you that Simpatico is just a platform to come have these conversations, even a bigger conversation with other panel discussions and such. So certainly appreciate it.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, we would love to continue working with Simpatico. And yeah, we have a lot of ideas for topics, but also colleagues of mine, I know they would be very keen
Excellent.
to dive into certain topics, very specific, like about the budget, the next EU budget. Discuss that during one episode. Like, we are open to of course brainstorm a bit with you guys. But yeah, happy to continue this engagement.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to bring you back into just chatting, but hold on, and thanks again for coming on.
Okay, thank you.